Welcome, dear listener, to this quiet journey through the annals of history. As you settle in for a restful slumber or a moment of peaceful reflection, I invite you to transport your mind to a distant time and place. Imagine, if you will, a realm of stone castles, grand tapestries, and regal pageantry, the world of medieval Europe. Before we embark on our exploration of the lives of royal women in this era, I'd love to know where in the world you're joining us from today. Whether it's morning, noon, or night in your corner of the globe, I'm so glad you've chosen to spend this time with me. If you enjoy this type of calm, historical storytelling, I warmly encourage you to subscribe so we can embark on many more adventures through the ages together. Now let us gently step back in time to an age that is often romanticized in tales of chivalry and courtly love. But for the women of royal blood who lived in these times, life was often far from a fairy tale. Theirs was a world of great uncertainty where political alliances could shift on a whim, and the very survival of dynasties rested on their shoulders. Picture yourself in a drafty, damp stone chamber, the flickering light of candles casting dancing shadows on the wall. This is the bedchamber of a medieval queen. A woman who, despite her lofty title, often faced a precarious and perilous existence. The grand tapestries and rich velvet curtains may create an illusion of warmth and comfort, but the reality for even the most high-born women of this time was often one of hardship and danger. In the pages of history books, we may catch glimpses of queens bedecked in jewels and crowned in gold, their names etched alongside those of kings. But the true stories of these women, their fears, their struggles, their triumphs, are often lost in the mists of time. Tonight, we'll endeavor to bring those stories to life once more, to illuminate the shadows of the past and pay tribute to the resilience and strength of the women who lived them. As we journey back to the Middle Ages, keep in mind that life for royal women was a constant balancing act between duty and survival. From the moment of their birth, princesses were viewed as valuable political commodities. Their marriages arranged to forge alliances and secure peace between kingdoms. They were expected to be pious, virtuous, and above all, to provide heirs to secure the royal line. But in a world where the whims of men could determine the fate of nations, even the most exalted women lived under the constant threat of danger. Assassination, revolt, and warfare were ever-present spectres lurking in the shadows of even the grandest castles. And in an age where medical knowledge was rudimentary at best, the very act of fulfilling their most essential duty, bearing children, could be a death sentence. Yet even in the face of such adversity, many royal women managed to carve out spheres of influence and leave their mark on history. Some ruled as regents in their husbands' stead, skillfully navigating the treacherous waters of medieval politics. Others became patrons of the arts and learning, using their wealth and status to foster cultural growth. And a few, through sheer force of will and personality, managed to defy the conventions of their time and seize power in their own right. As we delve into the stories of these remarkable women, I invite you to let your imagination transport you to their world. Picture yourself walking the stone hallways of a medieval castle, the hem of your gown trailing on the rushes strewn across the floor. Imagine the weight of a jeweled crown upon your brow and the whispered intrigues of courtiers echoing in your ears. In the coming hours, we'll meet queens and princesses, duchesses and countesses, women who faced unimaginable challenges and yet left an indelible mark on the pages of history. So settle in, dear listener, and let the tales of these bygone heroines paint pictures in your mind as you drift off to a peaceful slumber. Our first stop on this journey through time will be the turbulent life of Matilda, daughter of King Henry I of England. Born in 1102, Matilda was destined from birth to be a pawn in the great game of medieval politics. As the only legitimate child of Henry I, she was his heir apparent, a status that would lead to a lifetime of struggle and strife. Matilda's early years were marked by the kind of upheaval that was all too common for royal women of her time. When she was just 8 years old, she was sent to Germany to be married to Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor. This was a political alliance, pure and simple, a way for her father to secure a powerful ally on the continent. For young Matilda, it meant being torn away from all that was familiar and thrust into a foreign court, where her fate sealed by the machinations of men she barely knew. As Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, Matilda was expected to play the role of beautiful wife and queen. She was known for her piety and her patronage of religious houses, virtues that were highly prized in a medieval consort. But Matilda's life was not to be a quiet one of domestic contentment. In 1125, Emperor Henry V died suddenly, leaving Matilda a widow at the age of just 23. And so she found herself once again at the center of a political maelstrom. With no male heirs to inherit the Holy Roman Empire, Matilda was forced to fight for her rights as a ruler in her own name. She returned to England, where her father named her his heir presumptive, a move that was virtually unprecedented in a time when the idea of a woman ruling in her own right was almost unthinkable. But Matilda's claim to the throne was far from secure. When Henry I died in 1135, the stage was set for a showdown between Matilda and her cousin Stephen of Blais, who had seized the throne in her absence. What followed was a period of chaos and civil war known as the Anarchy, as Matilda and Stephen battled for supremacy. For nearly 2 decades, England was torn apart by conflict as the two claimants to the throne and their supporters clashed in a series of bloody battles and sieges. Throughout it all, Matilda displayed a tenacity and force of will that was remarkable for a woman of her time. She personally led armies into battle, endured harrowing sieges, and narrowly escaped capture on more than one occasion. In 1141, she came tantalizingly close to securing the throne, even holding court in London as Lady of the English. But the tides of war and the prejudices of men were ultimately too much to overcome. In the end, it was Matilda's son, Henry II, who would go on to rule England, founding the great Plantagenet dynasty. But Matilda's legacy lived on not just in her progeny, but in the very idea that a woman could aspire to rule in her own right. Her story is a testament to the indomitable spirit of medieval royal women who often faced unimaginable adversity and yet somehow found the strength to persevere. In a time when women were often seen as little more than property to be traded and bargained with, Matilda dared to fight for her place in history. As we continue our journey through the lives of medieval queens and princesses, we'll encounter many more stories of resilience and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. From Elelana of Aquitaine to Isabella of France, these women navigated the treacherous waters of medieval politics with skill and determination. But for now, dear listener, let us pause and reflect on the life of Matilda, a woman who defied the conventions of her time and left an indelible mark on the pages of history. As you drift off to sleep, picture her riding at the head of her army, her banner snapping in the wind, her eyes fixed on the horizon, and the crown that was her birthright. In our next chapter, we'll explore the fate of royal women who were sent far from home to serve as political pawns in the great game of medieval diplomacy. Imagine being a young princess, barely in your teens, dispatched to a foreign land to marry a man you've never met, all for the sake of a political alliance. This was the fate of countless royal women in the Middle Ages, who often found themselves at the mercy of the men who governed their lives. From Elelana of Aquitaine to Marguerite of Provence, we'll meet queens who endured loveless marriages, dangerous intrigues, and the constant threat of exile or imprisonment. But for now, let the tale of Matilda's valor and determination be the last image in your mind as you slip into a restful slumber. Her story is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit has an incredible capacity for resilience and strength. Good night, dear listener, and sweet dreams. When next we meet, we'll continue our exploration of the lives of medieval royal women, lives marked by duty, danger, and the eternal struggle for power and survival in a world dominated by men. As we've seen, medieval queens and princesses face the ever-present spectre of childbirth, a perilous and often deadly ordeal in an age before modern medicine. One such tragic tale is that of Anne Neville, wife to King Richard III and Queen of England for just over a year. Born into the influential Neville family, Anne was no stranger to the twists and turns of fortune that characterized the lives of medieval noble women. Her father, known as Warwick, the Kingmaker, was instrumental in deposing King Henry V and installing Edward IV on the throne. But when Warwick later turned against Edward, widowed and taken prisoner, Anne's future was thrust into uncertainty. In a twist of fate, she would soon marry Richard, Duke of Gloucester, her late husband's rival, and the future Richard III. When Richard took the throne in 1483, Anne was crowned his queen consort in a lavish ceremony, but her tenure as queen would be heartbreakingly brief. Just a year later, Anne faced the devastating loss of her only child, 10-year-old Edward of Middle. The prince's death left Richard without an heir, and by all accounts, Anne was shattered by the loss. Compounding this tragedy, Anne's own health soon took a turn for the worse. By March of 1485, the 28-year-old queen was dead, possibly of tuberculosis, or, as some whispered, of a broken heart. Her life and tragic end exemplify the precarious position of even the most high-born of medieval women, forever at the mercy of political machinations and the cruel whims of fate. Worn down by grief and illness, Anne Neville was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, the same hallowed ground where she had so recently been crowned. The grandeur of her funeral only underscored the fleeting nature of her glory. In just a few short months, her husband too would be dead, slain in battle by Henry Tudor. And so the wheel of fortune turned once more, ushering in a new dynasty and consigning Anne to the shadows of history. But while Anne Neville's life was cut tragically short, other medieval queens managed to carve out a lasting legacy through their piety and patronage. In an era when a woman's role was tightly circumscribed, acts of religious devotion and cultural sponsorship provided an acceptable outlet for their wealth and influence. One such patron was Philippa of Halt, Queen of England, as the wife of King Edward III. Philippe is often overshadowed by her formidable mother-in-law Isabella of France, whom we'll come to later. But in her own quiet way, Philippa left an indelible mark on the cultural landscape of 14th century England. Born into the French-speaking nobility of Hull, now part of Belgium, Philippa was married to Edward in a diplomatic alliance at the tender age of 13, coming to a foreign land and navigating the complex web of English court politics couldn't have been easy for the young princess. But, by all accounts, Philippe rose to the challenge with grace and fortitude. As queen, Philippa became known for her piety and generosity. She was a frequent benefactor of religious houses, donating jewels and rich gifts to her favoured establishments. But perhaps her most enduring legacy was her patronage of Queen's College, Oxford. Founded in 1341 at Philip's urging, Queen's College was innovative in its mission to provide education to students from her native Hall. At a time when university education was largely the preserve of the English elite, this was a groundbreaking move. Philip's influence also shaped the college aesthetically. The magnificent Queen's College Chapel, with its soaring windows and vated ceiling, was built under her sponsorship. Philippe's patronage extended beyond the religious and into the literary sphere. She was a key supporter of Jean Froissart, one of the most notable chroniclers of the 14th century. Under her patronage, Froissart began his famous chronicles, a vivid, if not always impartial account of the 100 Years' War between England and France. Philippa's story reminds us that while medieval queens were often consigned to the sidelines of power, they could still wield significant influence through their cultural and religious patronage. In a world where women's voices were often silenced, the language of art, architecture, and pious works allowed them to leave their mark on history. But for all the solace that religion and patronage could provide, the fact remained that a medieval queen's life was ultimately subject to the whims of men. And when political winds shifted, even the most influential of women could find themselves cast out into the cold. Such was the fate of Marguerite of Provence, Queen of France, as the wife of Louis XX. Margaret's story takes us from the heights of influence to the depths of despair, painting a vivid picture of the precarity of a medieval queen's position. Born into the nobility of Provence, Margaret was renowned for her beauty and intellect. Married to Louis at the age of just 13, she initially enjoyed a position of great influence at the French court. The young king was evidently enamored with his bride, and Margaret used her sway to promote the interests of her provincial relatives and allies. But Margaret's power soon drew the eye of the French nobility, who resented the influence of these foreign interlopers. Whispers began to circulate of Margaret's alleged infidelity, casting aspersions on the revolutionary, right? But before we uncork the champagne, let's talk about how they were expected to talk. Freud and his followers often viewed anxiety in women as the result of repressed sexual desire or internalized guilt, usually directed at their parents. If you were anxious, it was likely because you were suppressing something scandalous. You just didn't know it yet. Were you afraid to leave the house? Clearly symbolic. Having recurring nightmares, probably a metaphor for your mother panic attacks, definitely something Freudian, probably phallic. And while this new method of treatment was less physically violent, it still came with its own subtle form of blame. The problem was inside you, not your circumstances, not the trauma, not the stifling expectations placed on your shoulders. You just needed to unpack it. And if you didn't get better, maybe you weren't trying hard enough. Maybe you were resisting the truth. Psychoanalysis spread like wildfire among the intellectual elite. In smoky Viennese rooms, doctors scribbled notes while women whispered about their dreams and fears, still trying to be taken seriously, still trying to be heard. It was progress, yes, but fragile progress, because even though the cages had been traded for couches, women's anxiety was still being interpreted through a male lens, often reduced to libido, longing, or lingering daddy issues. And so the question remained, could a woman ever simply be anxious without being seen as broken? Or would every tremble, every tear, every silent scream be pinned to a theory instead of a truth? It's the 1950s now. The war is over, the lawn is trimmed, and your casserole is expected to be on the table by 6. You're a woman in suburbia, polished nails, bright smile, pearls around your neck, and your anxiety. Well, darling, that's not something we talk about because according to glossy magazines and daytime radio, everything is fine. So why do you feel like screaming? Enter Mother's Little Helper, the nickname for a small pill with a big promise, calmness, specifically Valium, and its earlier cousin, Miltown. These little sedatives were marketed directly to women, especially housewives, who felt overwhelmed, underappreciated, or quietly unraveling in a sea of matching Tupperware. Feeling sad, anxious, numb? Just pop a pill, dear, and smile for the neighbors. Doctors handed them out like candy. No one asked about trauma. No one asked about loneliness. No one wondered if spending every day vacuuming in heels while pretending everything was perfect might be crushing. Because in this new world of conformity and consumerism, a woman's role was to be content. And if she wasn't, clearly something was wrong with her. Not the role, not the expectations, not the endless isolation. Pharmaceutical companies leaned into this narrative with disturbing enthusiasm. One ad for tranquilizers featured a woman gripping the sink with the caption, "You can't set her free, but you can help her feel less trapped." Another proudly promised peace of mind for overburdened housewives. You know, the ones holding the family together with a smile and a rising dose of benzodiazepines. By the 1960s, millions of women were medicated, not because they were mentally ill, but because they were exhausted, because they were sad and didn't know why, because they were human in a culture that didn't allow them to be. And while these drugs offered short-term relief, they often came with long-term dependency, but no one talked about that. Addiction, after all, was considered unladylike, so they smiled, they swallowed. And somewhere deep beneath the sedation, the real question lingered. What if her anxiety wasn't a disorder? What if it was a warning? A silent scream from a soul that was never allowed to speak? By the 1970s, something had shifted. The casserole was still warm, the house still tidy, but now the woman inside it had questions like, why am I the only one sedated? Why does my pain come with a prescription but not a conversation? And who decided that anxiety was something I should apologize for? The feminist movement was swelling, not with rage, but with clarity. Women were beginning to talk in consciousness, raising groups across living rooms and campuses. They compared notes, and what they discovered was they weren't alone. Anxiety, they realized, wasn't some personal flaw. It wasn't just hormones or hysteria. It was often the logical result of being overworked, unheard, and expected to perform emotional labor like it was part of the furniture. Books like The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan cracked the polished surface of post-war domesticity, revealing the problem that has no name. It described women who felt empty, anxious, restless, despite having everything society told them they should want. Finally, someone said it. It's not in your head, it's in the walls, the expectations, the silence. And once the silence broke, there was no going back. It was a remarkable inversion of the traditional gender roles of medieval society. A woman wielding the reins of power with a man as her consort and enforcer. But as with all tales of power and ambition, Isabella's story did not have a happy ending. Her son Edward III chafed under the yoke of Mortimer's influence and eventually staged his own coup, having his mother's lover arrested and executed. Isabella herself was spared but spent the rest of her life in luxurious exile, stripped of her power and influence. In the end, Isabella of France's story stands as a testament to the extraordinary lengths to which a medieval queen might go to assert her own agency in a world dominated by men. Through sheer force of will and personality, she upended the established order, seizing power in a way that few women of her time could have dreamed of. But her tale also serves as a cautionary one, a reminder of the perils that awaited even the most formidable of women in the cutthroat world of medieval politics. For in the end, Isabella's grasp on power was always tenuous, dependent on the whims of the men around her. When those whims shifted, as they inevitably did, she found herself cast aside, a victim of the very same forces she had once sought to control. As we come to the end of our journey through the lives of these remarkable women, it's worth reflecting on the harsh realities they faced. To be a queen in the Middle Ages was to walk a constant tightrope, balanced precariously between power and peril. On the one hand, these women enjoyed a level of privilege and influence that was unimaginable to most of their contemporaries. They had access to wealth, education, and cultural resources that set them apart from the vast majority of medieval society. Some, like Filipe Rovino, used this privilege to leave a lasting mark on the world through acts of patronage and piety. But on the other hand, these women were also acutely vulnerable, their fates tied to the shifting winds of dynastic politics and the whims of the men around them. They faced constant threats to their safety and well-being, from the perils of childbirth to the machinations of rivals and enemies. Some, like Anne Neville, met with tragedy and heartbreak, their lives cut short by the cruel twists of fate. And even those who managed to carve out a sphere of influence like Isabella of France did so at great personal risk. In a world where power was the ultimate prize, a woman who dared to reach for it could just as easily find herself cast down into the abyss. Perhaps what's most striking about these stories is the sheer resilience and fortitude of the women who lived them. In the face of unimaginable adversity, they found ways to endure, to adapt, and even to thrive. Whether through acts of piety, patronage, or sheer political maneuvering, they asserted their agency in a world that sought to deny it to them at every turn. In the end, their stories serve as a powerful reminder of the extraordinary capacity of the human spirit to overcome even the most daunting of obstacles. They may have lived in a world far removed from our own, but the challenges they faced of love and loss, of power and peril, are ones that still resonate across the centuries. So as we close the book on this chapter of history, let us remember these women, not just as queens and consorts, but as individuals, each with her own unique story to tell. In doing so, we honor their memory and the enduring legacy they left behind. And with that, we come to the end of our journey through the lives of medieval queens. I hope that in some small way, Their stories have shed light on the complex realities of life in the Middle Ages. A world of grandeur and squalor, of piety and violence, of love and loss. But more than that, I hope they've served as a reminder of the extraordinary resilience and strength of the human spirit. These women, for all the challenges they faced, found ways to leave their mark on history through their patronage, their piety, and their sheer force of will. As we drift off to sleep, let us carry their stories with us, a testament to the enduring power of the human experience across time and across cultures. And let us remember that even in the darkest of times, there is always a glimmer of light to be found, a flicker of hope that can guide us through to brighter days ahead. Good night and sweet dreams. As we've seen, medieval queens and princesses often found their lives shaped by forces far beyond their control. Married off to secure alliances, sent to foreign courts and pressured to produce male heirs. But perhaps no aspect of their lives was more harrowing and dangerous than the perils of childbirth. In an age long before modern medicine, obstetrical care was rudimentary at best. Midwives who attended most births relied more on folklore and tradition than scientific knowledge. The concept of high labor took place in dark, stuffy chambers, on beds soiled with the bodily fluids of previous births. Instruments, when used, were not properly cleaned. It's hardly surprising that puerperal fever caused by bacterial infections was rampant. For a queen, the risks were compounded by the immense pressure to deliver a healthy son. The succession of a dynasty, the stability of a kingdom, could hinge on the sex of a newborn. Imagine laboring for hours or days in excruciating pain, fearing not only for your own life but also the political fallout if you failed to produce an heir. The tragic story of Anne Neville, wife of King Richard III, illustrates just how dangerous childbirth could be, even for those at the very pinnacle of society. At just 16, Anne became Queen of England when her husband seized the throne. An intelligent and influential woman, she gave birth to the couple's only legitimate son, Edward of Middle, around 1476. But only a decade later, both Anne and her young son fell gravely ill, likely from tuberculosis. Despite her elevated status, there was little doctors could do. In a matter of months, Anne watched helplessly as her son wasted away and died, her own health broken. She lived only a few months more before succumbing herself at Westminster Palace in March 1485. She was just 28 years old. Anne's heartbreaking tale was all too common in an era when medicine was powerless against so many ills. For every queen who successfully navigated the perils of childbirth, dozens did not. It's a stark reminder of just how fragile life could be, even for those born to privilege and power. Of course, some royal women did manage to wield influence and authority despite the constraints placed upon them, but to do so often required extraordinary strength of will and personality. They had to navigate not only the dangers of the birthing bed, but the cutthroat intrigues of court politics as well. One such formidable figure was Philippa of Hold, Queen of England. As the wife of King Edward III, married at just 13, Philippa quickly demonstrated her intelligence and political acumen. She deftly managed the royal household and served as an important advisor to her husband. But Philippa's most enduring impact may have been as a patron of the arts and scholarship. She sponsored writers like Jean Frazard and provided pensions for scholars at Oxford University. The Queen's College at Oxford, founded in 1341, still bears her name today. In an age when women were largely excluded from formal education, Philippe helped foster a flourishing of learning and culture. Her story hints at the ways some exceptional women were able to shape their own destinies, even within the rigid constraints of medieval queenship. They may have been political pawns, but they weren't always passive ones. Still, for the vast majority of royal women, the realities of their lives were harsher and more circumscribed. Even queens who enjoyed relatively stable and successful marriages could find themselves facing the precariousness of their position if their husband died. Without a male protector, a widowed queen could quickly become vulnerable to the machinations of ambitious nobles or the hostility of a new king. Some sought safety by retiring to a convent. Others threw themselves on the mercy of their relatives. A lucky few were able to carve out a role for themselves as dagger queens, using their wisdom and experience to advise the new ruler. But even this was a tenuous existence, always at the pleasure of the reigning monarch. For a particularly vivid illustration, we need look no further than the story of Marguerite of Provence, wife of Louis IX of France. A savvy and strong-willed woman, Marguerite wielded considerable influence over her husband and served as regent in his absence. But when Louise died in 1270, Marguerite's fortunes quickly changed. Her son, now King Philip III, was estranged from her and resentful of her influence. Facing increasing hostility at court, Margaret went on pilgrimage, traveling to the Holy Land in the hopes of securing allies and support. But the new king outmaneuvered her, intercepting her letters and turning her own household against her. Increasingly isolated, Marguerite eventually went into exile in Provence, living out her remaining years far from the centers of power she had once controlled. Hers is a stark illustration of just how quickly a queen's fortunes could change. No matter how powerful or influential she might be during her husband's reign, a royal widow could find herself cast aside, marginalized, or even persecuted once a new king took the throne. The chessboard of medieval politics was forever in flux, with queens as vulnerable as any other piece. Of course, not every queen went quietly into exile or retirement. Some, like the infamous Isabella of France, fought back against the powerlessness of their position with Married to Edward II of England, Isabella chafed at her husband's neglect and the undue influence of his male favorites at court. In 1325, she returned to her native France, ostensibly to negotiate a peace treaty. But once there, Isabella set about plotting an invasion to depose her own husband. With the help of her lover, Roger Mortimer, she raised an army and sailed for England, landing in 1326. The country quickly rallied to her cause, and Edward II was captured and forced to abdicate in favor of his young son. Isabella now ruled as regent in all but name. It was a stunning reversal. A woman overthrowing the rightful king, but Isabella's bold gambit illustrates just how high the stakes could be for medieval queens. Deprived of official power, they could still find ways to exert their will, even if it meant resorting to violence and intrigue. Isabella's story is a vivid reminder that while royal women were often pawns, they weren't always passive ones. Through cunning, determination, and sheer force of will, a few managed to upset the chessboard and seize some measure of control over their own fates. But such dramatic coups were the exception rather than the rule. For most medieval queens and princesses, life was a constant negotiation of the limits placed upon them by a deeply patriarchal society. Valued mainly for their wombs, they faced immense pressure to produce male heirs. Subject to the whims of fathers, husbands, and sons, their lives were forever precarious. Some found a measure of autonomy through religious devotion or patronage of the arts. Others forged alliances and exerted soft power behind the scenes. A tenacious few even managed to rule as regents or wield overt political influence. But none could fully escape the brutal realities of their position. In a world where power was the preserve of men, royal women faced a constant struggle to shape their own destinies. The perils of childbirth, the capriciousness of dynastic politics, the looming threat of marginalization or exile, these were the inescapable conditions of their lives. And so we return to that draughty castle chamber, to the exhausted figure of the medieval queen, surveying her cramped world of tapestries and smoky fires. She may live amidst grandeur, clad in silks and jewels and waited on by a vast retinue, but she knows her true worth is measured only in the sons she can produce. Her power, her very survival, is always contingent. It's a grim portrait, a sobering antidote to our romantic notions of medieval royalty. But it's also a testament to the resilience and resourcefulness of the women who endured these hardships. Deprived of autonomy, beset by dangers, they nevertheless found ways to leave their mark on history. In their stories, in the triumphs and tragedies, the acts of piety and patronage and intrigue, we catch a glimpse of lives lived under extraordinary pressure, and we're reminded that even in the most constrained of circumstances, the human spirit has a remarkable capacity for endurance and even defiance. So let us spare a thought for Matilda and Elena, for Anne and Philippa, and Marguerite and Isabella, and for the countless anonymous royal women whose names are lost to history. Theirs was a brutal and often thankless existence, but one that nevertheless shaped the course of nations and dynasties. In remembering their struggles, we honor their grit and tenacity in the face of overwhelming odds. As the candles flickered in the draughty bedchamber, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls, Marguerite of Provence clutched her rosary beads and uttered a fervent prayer. She was about to embark on a perilous journey, a pilgrimage that would take her far from the relative safety and comfort of the royal court. In the 13th century, embarking on a religious pilgrimage was one of the few occasions when a queen might undertake extensive travel. The Church heartily approved of these acts of public piety by royal women. Marguerite, wife of the celebrated French King Louis IX, had vowed to make a pilgrimage to the Abbey of Cluny if her husband safely returned from the Seventh Crusade. When Louis finally arrived back on French soil, after 6 long years away, Margaret immediately set about fulfilling her promise to God. She would journey from Paris to the renowned abbey in Burgundy, a voyage of nearly 200 miles, an immense distance, in an age when most people rarely ventured more than a few miles from their birthplace. For a queen to undertake such a long, arduous journey was no small matter. The roads were perilous, often little more than muddy, rooted tracks that wound through dense forests and over steep hills. Brigands and highwaymen posed a constant threat to travellers. Moreover, a royal entourage required vast amounts of provisions, not to mention costly gifts to present at the holy sites along the way. Marguerite would have ridden a man's honour written on his skin like scripture. In Japan, the story is just as layered, maybe more. Early Japanese tattoos called iriumi were used to ward off evil spirits, protect fishermen, or even symbolize status. But as in China, tattoos also became tools of punishment. Criminals were marked with lines on the arms or symbols on the forehead. In some regions, each crime added another stroke, a tally of dishonor visible to all. But over time, something changed. By the Edo period, 1600s, 1800s, full-body tattoos began to emerge as an underground art form. Vibrant, elaborate designs, dragons, coyish gods, demons, began to stretch across the backs, arms, and legs of commoners. These weren't criminals, these were firemen, laborers, and gamblers, men with dangerous jobs and even more dangerous reputations. And then came the Yakuza, Japan's feared crime syndicates, who embraced full-body iris as symbols of strength, loyalty, and fearlessness. The more coverage, the more respect, and the more pain you endured. These weren't tattoos for the public. They were private, hidden beneath suits, revealed only in bathhouse or in battle. In both China and Japan, tattoos lived in tension, art and punishment, identity and exile, a constant dance between pride and shame. Because sometimes the ink that marks you also defines you. In ancient Europe, tattoos walked a thin line between power and punishment, depending entirely on who held the needle and who bore the mark. Let's begin with the Celts and the Picts, tribal peoples who lived in what is now Britain and Scotland. When Roman soldiers first encountered them, they were stunned. These warriors, some naked, some cloaked in wolf pelts, were covered in swirling blue tattoos, fierce spirals and knots etched across their faces and bodies. The dye wu, a plant-based ink that stained the skin deep blue like thunderclouds rolled across flesh. These weren't decorations. They were battle armor, intimidation, identity. To tattoo your body was to declare, "I am not afraid to bleed." Julius Caesar described them in his writings, half in awe, half in horror, calling them wild and barbaric, which is ironic considering what Rome did next. Because while the Romans prided themselves on law and order, they also used tattoos not as symbols of honor, but as tools of control. Criminals, slaves, and prisoners of war were tattooed with marks of ownership or shame. A runaway slave might be branded with the letters FVG, short for fugitivis. A soldier who deserted his legion, inked forever with disgrace. Even Roman Christians in the empire's early days were sometimes tattooed to mark them as enemies of the state, or worse, heretics. These were not badges, these were burdens. And yet not all Roman tattooing was punishment. Some soldiers, particularly in the eastern provinces, began to tattoo themselves voluntarily, symbols of loyalty to their legion or devotion to a deity. Quiet rebellion inked beneath the armor. Over time, as Christianity spread and gained power, tattooing across Europe fell further into disrepute. By the early Middle Ages, it was largely condemned as pagan, sinful, or barbaric. The body was now seen as a temple, and temples apparently were best left unpainted. But deep in the forests and along the misty moors, the old traditions lived on, whispered through generations, passed from mother to daughter, warrior to warrior. Because long before ink was criminal, it was tribal. And in the blood-soaked soils of ancient Europe, tattooing was proof you belonged to your people, to your land, to your gods. As Europe entered the long stretch of the Middle Ages, tattooing faded from the spotlight, but it never vanished. It simply went underground. The Christian Church, now a dominant force across the continent, condemned tattooing. The body was to remain pure, unblemished, a vessel of holiness. Pagan customs, including tattoos, were swept aside, labeled heathen, rebellious, or worse, demonic. And yet, even in this era of suppression, ink still found its way beneath the skin. Among Christian pilgrims, especially those who made the treacherous journey to Jerusalem, tattoos became symbols of devotion. A small cross tattooed on the wrist or forearm was proof. I made it. You had survived the seas, the deserts, the bandits, and you came home marked by faith. Some pilgrims even received these tattoos while in the Holy Land, etched by Coptic Christian families who had preserved the sacred art for generations. These weren't decorative, they were spiritual contracts, reminders etched in flesh that said, I belong to God and I went to his city. In some monasteries, tattoos were used to identify members of certain orders. Hidden symbols, discreet and purposeful. There are whispers, though rarely confirmed, of knights from the Crusades tattooing holy relics, saints, or sacred words onto their arms and chests before battle. If they were to die far from home, at least their body would bear the mark of heaven. Mark of heaven. Meanwhile, outside the church's walls, folk traditions endured. In remote villages and forested regions, old customs lingered. Women tattooed protective symbols on their hands during childbirth. Shepherds inked sacred patterns to ward off wolves. These weren't fashion statements, they were prayers with pigment, but still to be tattooed in medieval Europe was to exist on the edges, spiritually suspect, socially scrutinized, unless of course you were branded by force. Criminals, prisoners, slaves, all could be marked. And in those cases, the tattoo wasn't a choice, it was a sentence. So the Middle Ages became a paradox, a time when ink was both forbidden and revered, sacred and shamed, a time when tattoos weren't loud, they were whispers, whispers of faith, of defiance, of the enduring human need to leave a mark, even when the world said not to. As the sails of European ships began cutting across oceans in the 16th and 17th centuries, tattoos returned to the Western world, not through science or religion, but through salt water and superstition. Explorers like Captain James Cook didn't just map coastlines, they encountered cultures where tattooing was sacred, particularly in Palynia. Cook's sailors, fascinated by the bold patterns and meanings of the tattoo, began getting inked themselves. It was exotic, dangerous, and rebellious. All the things a bored sailor craved. From there, tattooing spread through the ports like spilled rum. Sailors began crafting their own tattoo culture, part survival, part tradition, and part bragging rights. A ship's anchor on the forearm meant you'd crossed the Atlantic. A turtle. You'd crossed the equator, officially a shellback. A pig and rooster on your feet. A charm to protect against drowning because, oddly enough, those animals were often the only ones to survive shipwrecks, floating safely in their wooden crates. Each tattoo had meaning, though the meanings often changed with the tides. An image of a dagger through a heart might mean lost love, or just a rough night in a Caribbean tavern. Hold fast across the knuckles was a prayer for grip, not on life, but on wet rigging in stormy seas. Tattooing became an unofficial language among sailors. No matter your flag, your mother tongue, or your luck with rum, ink could tell your story. It was shared identity in an ocean of loneliness. In doeside towns like New York, London, and Lisbon, tattoo parlors began to appear, small, smoky rooms filled with inkpots and tales from faraway lands. These weren't the artists of sacred temples. They were former sailors themselves, often using homemade needles and gunpowder soot. But for men who faced drowning, disease, and mutiny, a little pain for a permanent memory didn't seem so bad. Tattoos became keepsakes, confessions, maps of the places you'd been, and the parts of yourself you couldn't leave behind. In an era when most people's stories faded with time, sailors wrote theirs in ink and let the sea carry them into legend. By the late 19th century, tattooing was no longer just the mark of the sailor or the outsider. Thanks to a spark, quite literally, from electricity, tattoos were stepping into the modern world. In 1891, Samuel O'Reilly, a New York-based tattooist, filed a patent for the first electric tattoo machine. Inspired by Thomas Edison's electric pen, O'Reilly's device allowed for faster, more precise work, and with far less blood. Suddenly tattoos could be done in hours instead of days. Pain was still part of the package, but now the process felt less like surgery and more like art. And with this came a new era, the tattoo as performance. Circus sideshows and dime museums began to feature tattooed men and women as curiosities. There was Captain George Constantini's, the tattooed Greek prince, whose entire body was covered in intricate Eastern designs, and Nora Hildebrandt, one of America's first tattooed ladies, whose ink was matched only by the dramatic and likely fabricated tale of her captivity and forced tattooing by a savage tribe. These performers weren't just oddities, they were living exhibitions. Their bodies became walking stories, drawing crowds and challenging Victorian ideas of propriety, especially when a woman removed her sleeves and revealed a serpent curled around her shoulder. Yet tattoos remained taboo among respectable society. If you had ink, it meant something. You'd been to war, to sea, to jail, or you'd run away with the circus. And yet behind closed doors, the elite were quietly getting tattooed too. It's said that both King Edward VII and his son, the future George V, had tattoos, one with a Jerusalem cross, the other with a dragon etched in Japan. Aristocrats in Europe and even some American high society figures began to explore the novelty of body art discreetly, privately, always with plausible deniability. Tattoo parlors flourished in port cities, but now they began appearing in urban centers too. Small studios tucked between barbershops and billiard halls, and while most artists were still men, women were beginning to enter the craft, needle in hand. The ink was spreading, no longer just a mark of rebellion. It was becoming a medium for memory, identity, or simply the thrill of wearing something no one could take away. As the 20th century marched forward with skyscrapers, revolutions, and wars, tattoos continued their quiet evolution, but not always in the light. Behind prison walls, in locked cells and concrete yards, a new language of ink was being written, not on paper but on skin. These weren't polished studio tattoos. They were handmade, raw, created with contraband needles, guitar strings, melted plastic, and ink brewed from soot and toothpaste. Painful, absolutely. Precise, rarely. Meaningful, always. In prisons across the world, from Russia's gulags to American penitentiaries, tattoos became a secret code. Every image told a story, every placement carried weight, a spiderweb on the elbow, time served, a teardrop near the eye, a life taken or a life lost. 5 dots on the hand, 4 corners and 1 in the center, meant I am surrounded. In Soviet prisons, tattooing became a detailed system of status and survival. A cathedral inked across the chest could signal years behind bars, each dome a sentence, stars on the shoulders, a high-ranking inmate not to be disrespected, but faking a rank through ink that could get you killed. These tattoos weren't just decoration. They were armor, a resume, a warning, a prayer. In the United States, prison tattoos carried similar weight. Gang affiliations, racial lines, territorial claims, and personal losses. The The tattoo gun was often a shared tool. The ink passed between inmates like contraband communion. For many, their first tattoo wasn't a choice, it was a rite of passage. But even outside the walls, these prison-born styles began to leak into the wider world. Artists, especially in urban areas, began incorporating the stark, bold lines of prison art into their own work. What started as survival behind bars became a style replicated in shops, immortalized in movies, and echoed in street culture. Still, the stigma clung. A visible tattoo, especially one on the hands, neck, or face, often meant closed doors, judgment, suspicion. The ink might fade, but the assumptions remained. Yet for the ones who wore them, those marks weren't shame. They were stories of survival, of time endured, of identity carved in silence. Because sometimes when no one listens, the skin speaks. By the dawn of the 21st century, tattoos had undergone their greatest transformation yet, from ancient rite to outlaw code to something else entirely, a canvas for the self. What was once hidden under sleeves or spoken in hushed judgment was now proudly displayed on runways, in boardrooms, and across social feeds. From baristas to CEOs, kindergarten teachers to veterans, ink was no longer a symbol of rebellion. It had become a declaration of identity. The rise of tattoo studios mirrored this shift. No longer backroom shops with flickering neon signs, many became sanctuaries of expression. Clean, curated, and often more like art galleries than the gritty dens of old. Tattoo artists became celebrities in their own right, with portfolios, wait lists, and fans who flew across countries just to sit in their chair. Styles exploded: watercolor tattoos, fine line minimalism, realism so sharp it looked like photographs, sacred geometry, cultural revival, portraits of pets, loved ones, even entire life stories in spine to spine. Technology helped. Machines became quieter, needles finer, ink safer, healing faster. But beneath the aesthetics, the old reasons remained. People still came for the same things they always had: memory, mourning, power, rebirth. Some tattoos marked milestones: a birth, a death, a beginning. Others covered scars, both visible and hidden. Some people tattooed themselves after escaping abusive relationships. Some honored ancestors. Some wrote their survival in symbols they couldn't speak aloud. And yes, some just really liked frogs with cowboy hats. There's room for that too. Across the globe, indigenous tattoo practices began to resurface with pride. Maritamoko, Inuit, skin stitching, Filipino bok, ancient forms once shamed or outlawed were being revived by new generations, reconnecting lineage through line work. Yet debates remain about cultural appropriation, about over-commercialization. The story of the space race didn't begin with a spaceship or a star-eyed dream. It began with war. World War II had left the planet in ruins, cities shattered, borders redrawn, and two superpowers standing on opposite sides of a new world order. The United States and the Soviet Union, once uneasy allies, emerged as ideological opposites. Capitalism versus communism, democracy versus dictatorship. And in the ashes of Nazi Germany, both sides found something, or rather, someone they wanted. Veron Braun, the German engineer behind the deadly V-2 rocket, was captured by the Americans and quietly whisked to the US under Operation Paperclip. The Soviets, not to be outdone, seized German scientists and research of their own. The spoils of war now included rocket fuel, blueprints, and the mines to make them fly. The Cold War had begun, not with gunfire, but with silence and suspicion. Each side raced to build not only bombs, but delivery systems. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, became the new symbol of power. Rockets capable of carrying nuclear warheads from one continent to another. But it didn't take long before someone asked a different question. What if we pointed these toward the stars instead? Space became the next frontier, not for exploration, but for domination. It wasn't just about science, it was about symbolism. Whoever reached space first would claim moral superiority, technological supremacy, global awe. For the Soviets, the challenge was personal. After years of devastation and isolation, they saw space as a chance to prove their strength to the world and to themselves. In the United States, space became a matter of national pride and strategic necessity. Losing wasn't just a failure, it was a threat. And so two nations looked to the heavens, not with wonder, but with urgency. Rockets were no longer just weapons, they were ladders to prestige. And somewhere above Earth's atmosphere, a silent race had begun, a race of machines, a race of men, a race where the finish line wasn't a place, but a dream. It was a clear night on October 4th, 1957, when the world changed, not with a bang, but with a beep. From a launch site in the barren steppes of Kazakhstan, the Soviet Union sent a small metal sphere into orbit. It was called Sputnik 1. A shiny aluminum ball no larger than a beach ball weighing just under 200 pounds, with 4 long antennas poking from its sides. It had no camera, no passengers, just a radio transmitter that emitted a steady stream of beeps as it circled Earth every 96 minutes. But those beeps echoed like thunder. To the Soviets, Sputnik was proof of their triumph, the first artificial satellite ever launched by mankind. The first object made by human hands to break free from Earth's gravity. It was a staggering technical achievement. It meant their rockets worked. It meant they were ahead. To the Americans, it was a wake-up call wrapped in polished aluminum. Panic rippled through the United States. If the Soviets could launch a satellite into space, they could launch a nuclear warhead across the ocean. Schools ran duck and cover drills. Headlines screamed of a new red moon. And in living rooms across the country, people looked up and wondered, are they watching us now? Sputnik wasn't just a satellite, it was a signal. It told the world that the USSR had reached space first, and it turned space into a battlefield of prestige, politics, and paranoia. President Eisenhower tried to stay calm, insisting that the US was not falling behind. But behind the scenes, alarm bells rang. Funding for science programs skyrocketed. Congress rushed to create NASA. American school children were suddenly encouraged to study math and physics, not just to get good jobs, but to defend freedom. Within a month, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2, carrying a passenger, Laika, a stray dog plucked from the streets of Moscow. Laika became the first living creature to orbit the Earth. She would not survive the flight, but the message was clear. The Soviets weren't just ahead, they were accelerating. And now, for the first time, humanity was no longer alone in the stars. We had sent someone up, and the race had truly begun. The shock of Sputnik hit hard. In living rooms and laboratories, classrooms and Capitol Hill, the United States faced a difficult truth. It had been beaten into space, not by a more powerful nation, but by one that had been, until recently, a devastated wartime ally, now a fierce ideological rival. The question wasn't just how did they do it, it was what do we do now? The answer came fast. In 1958, the United States created a new agency, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. Built from the remnants of earlier aerospace programs, NASA was more than an agency. It was a declaration, a commitment, a promise that America would not only catch up, it would lead. But the first American satellite, Explorer 1, wasn't launched until January 31st, 1958, nearly 4 months after Sputnik. Still, it carried more than a radio beep. It discovered the Van Allen radiation belts, proving that the US wasn't just chasing, it was contributing to science. The space race had become a national mission. Television programs featured space science for children. Schools added rocket math to curriculums. Funding for science, engineering, and math surged. American identity was now linked to the cosmos. But politics has always steered the rocket, and this wasn't just about curiosity, it was about Cold War dominance. Space was the new high ground. Whoever controlled it would control communications, defense, and prestige. The US feared falling behind in the eyes of the world, especially newly independent nations choosing between capitalist democracy and communist rule. Enter Project Mercury, America's first manned spaceflight program. 7 test pilots, later dubbed the Mercury 7, were selected to represent not just NASA but the hopes of an entire nation. They trained in secret, they endured punishing physical and psychological tests, and they were turned into heroes before they'd ever left the ground. Meanwhile, the Soviets were preparing to raise the stakes even further because satellites were only the beginning. The next goal was clear: to send a human into space and bring them home. For America, the challenge was no longer hypothetical. It was real, personal, urgent, and it was only a matter of time before someone, Soviet or American, would risk their life to cross that invisible boundary between Earth and everything beyond it. April 12, 1961. Just after sunrise in the Kazakh desert, a slender silver rocket stood on the launch pad, tall, silent, and poised to change history. Inside it sat a 27-year-old Soviet pilot named Yuri Gagarin. He was calm, smiling, even clad in an orange flight suit and a white helmet. He looked more like a test pilot than a pioneer. But what he was about to do had never been done: leave Earth entirely. At 9:07 a.m. Moscow time, the Vostok 1 spacecraft roared to life. Gagarin's voice crackled through the radio with a single word that would echo across the planet: Pyakali, let's go. With that, he became the first human being to enter space. The flight lasted just 108 minutes. Gagarin completed 1 full orbit around Earth, reaching a peak altitude of 187 meters and traveling over 17,000 miles per hour. He looked down and saw our planet from above. The blue curve of Earth, the blackness of space, and no borders. He later described what he saw with simple wonder. The Earth is blue, how beautiful, it is amazing. But make no mistake, this was not just a moment of human achievement. It was a geopolitical earthquake. The Soviets had done it first. Again, after Sputnik, after Laika, they had now sent a man into space and returned him safely. Gagarin didn't just orbit Earth, he orbited every front page on the planet. The Soviets paraded him like a champion, a symbol of socialist superiority and scientific might. The United States, stunned once more, scrambled to respond. President Kennedy, only a few months into his presidency, now faced the pressure to match and surpass the Soviet triumph. Yuri Gagarin returned to Earth a hero, landing in a field and startling a farmer and her daughter before calmly explaining he had come from space. He never flew in space again, but his name was etched into history, because on that day, humanity crossed a line we'd only ever imagined. We were no longer earthbound. One man, one orbit, and the space race had officially entered its most human chapter. Just weeks after Yuri Gagarin made history, the United States was reeling, but not defeated. The Soviets had claimed the first victory in human spaceflight, but America had its own plan in motion to match and ultimately surpass the Soviet achievements. America's first step, Alan Shepard. On May 5, 1961, Shepard, a Navy test pilot, climbed into the Mercury Redstone 3 spacecraft, nicknamed Freedom 7. Shepard's mission wasn't to orbit the Earth. Instead, his was a suborbital flight, a brief but crucial hop into space that would prove the US could send humans into the skies and bring them back alive. The stakes were high. Shepard's flight was only going to last 15 minutes, a brief moment in space, but it was a public declaration. The United States was in the race, and it wasn't about to lose it. The countdown began, and at 9:34 a.m., the rocket launched with a roar that shook the ground. Shepard soared upward, climbing to 116 miles above Earth, entering space for just a few minutes. As he floated weightlessly, he experienced a moment of awe, looking down on the blue planet below him. He didn't have the chance to look long. After a short, thrilling journey, Shepard's flight took a sharp descent and landed in the Atlantic Ocean. Shepard was immediately rescued by a Navy ship. And as he stepped out of his capsule, he was hailed as a hero, the first American in space. Shepard's flight wasn't as impressive in terms of time or distance as Gagarin's orbital mission, but it was a crucial step in the US space program. It proved the Americans could launch men into space, and more importantly, they could bring them back safely. The United States had entered the race, and while it had been a short flight, it was a long leap toward the ultimate goal, the moon. Shepard's success spurred NASA into action. The Mercury program's first success now paved the way for the Gemini and Apollo programs. The US was now determined to go further, to go higher, and above all, to reach the ultimate frontier. The race to the moon wasn't just about rockets anymore. It was about pride, about the human will to reach beyond, and the stakes had never been higher. With Alan Shepard's suborbital flight and the brief but groundbreaking Mercury missions behind them, the United States had proven it could send humans into space. But now NASA had to answer a bigger question. Could they go further? Could they stay in space longer? And most importantly, could they reach the moon? Enter the Gemini program, the bridge between Mercury and the Apollo missions, the critical testing ground for technologies and techniques that would be required to land a human on the moon. Launched in 1965, the Gemini program was designed to test the limits of human spaceflight. It was bigger, bolder, and more ambitious. The Gemini spacecraft was twice as large as the Mercury capsule and could carry 2 astronauts, making it the first program to push the boundaries of extended space missions. Gemini's first flight, Gemini 3, took place on March 23, 1965, with astronauts Virgil, Gus Grissom, and John Young aboard. Their mission was brief, a simple orbit of Earth, but it marked a crucial turning point in human space exploration. Grissom's flight lasted just 5 hours, but it proved that 2 men could survive together in space, that they could pilot a spacecraft, and that they could manage critical life support systems in orbit. The Gemini missions began to increase in complexity. Gemini 4 in June 1965 marked the first American Space W walk, with astronaut Ed White floating in the vacuum of space for 23 minutes. This was an enormous step forward, demonstrating that humans could operate outside the confines of their spacecraft, a skill that would be essential for lunar exploration. Gemini also introduced the techniques that would make the Apollo mission possible, orbital rendezvous and docking, which were needed for the lunar mission. The program's ultimate goal was to prepare astronauts to operate in deep space, even if it meant spending days in orbit, performing complex maneuvers and testing the endurance required for longer missions. By the time Gemini 12 completed its final mission in November 1966, the groundwork had been laid. America was ready for the moon, and the Soviet Union, though still ahead in some respects, had little to show for its efforts in comparison. The United States was gearing up for its grandest challenge yet, a challenge that would not just test technology, but human spirit. The race to the moon was heating up, and the finish line was within reach. The year was 1961. President John F. Kennedy, inspired by the growing tension of the Cold War and the challenge of space, made a bold proclamation that would set the stage for one of humanity's greatest feats. On May 25th, he stood before a joint session of Congress and declared that the United States would land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. The stakes were now clear. It was no longer just about sending humans into space. It was about reaching the moon and bringing them back. This vision led to the birth of Apollo, NASA's program designed specifically for lunar exploration. The goal was unprecedented: to send astronauts to the moon, land them safely, and return them to Earth. The Apollo program was America's full-throttle response to the Soviet Union's achievements, an answer to their dominance in the space race. The first step was Apollo 1, a mission tragically marred by a fire on January 27, 1967, that claimed the lives of astronauts Gus Graham, Ed White, and Roger B. Chaffee during a pre-launch test. The fire was a devastating setback, but it also spurred an overhaul of NASA's safety protocols and equipment. The Apollo program pressed on with new determination and innovation, learning from the loss of those brave men. In 1968, Apollo 8 became the first mission to send astronauts into lunar orbit. As the crew, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders circled the moon, they became the first humans to see the far side of the moon with their own eyes. The sight of Earth rising above the lunar surface from the spacecraft's window was an image that captured the world's imagination and marked a milestone in human exploration. But the ultimate goal still lay ahead. The world watched as NASA prepared for Apollo 11, the mission that would make Kennedy's dream a reality. Tensions between the US and USSR were palpable, but the United States was determined to reach the moon first. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin made history. As Armstrong descended from the lunar module and stepped onto the surface of the moon, he famously declared, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." The United States had done it. The moon was no longer just a point in the sky. It was a place where humans had stood, a new world conquered. The space race had been won, but humanity's journey beyond Earth was just beginning. On July 20th, 1969, America had done the unthinkable. It had landed a man on the moon. The Apollo 11 mission had fulfilled President Kennedy's promise, and Neil Armstrong's first step onto the lunar surface echoed as both a national victory and a global triumph for humanity. But the space race wasn't over. After the glory of Apollo 11, the question now became, what comes next? For NASA, the immediate task was to complete the Apollo program. With 5 more successful moon landings between 1969 and 1972, astronauts explored different parts of the lunar surface, conducting experiments and collecting rock samples that would offer clues to the moon's history. Each mission reinforced the US position as the undisputed leader in space exploration. But while Apollo was successful, it came at an immense cost, both financially and in terms of human lives. The program had consumed resources and attention, and by the early 1970s, political support for further lunar missions began to wane. Cold War was still intensifying, but the urgency to outdo the Soviet Union in space was fading. As a result, the Apollo program was abruptly cut short after Apollo 17 in 1972. The immediate focus of space exploration shifted. The SkyAb program, launched in 1973, was America's first space station where astronauts lived and worked for extended periods, conducting experiments in microgravity. SkyAb demonstrated the viability of humans living in space for extended periods, laying the groundwork for future space stations and deep space missions. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, despite its initial successes, began to slow its space efforts. Although it had succeeded in sending the first human into space, the USSR never managed to land on the moon. The race was won, but the Soviets continued with unmanned missions to explore Venus and Mars, and even launched their own space station program, Salute, which eventually led to Mir, a massive orbital research station that became a symbol of Soviet scientific ambition in space. But it was the Space Shuttle program that would define the next era of space exploration. Launched in 1981, the shuttle was designed to be reusable, allowing for multiple missions with the same spacecraft. The shuttle era promised greater accessibility to space, enabling regular cargo and crew missions to low Earth orbit, and eventually the construction of the International Space Station. Despite the promise of these new frontiers, the early shuttle flights were fraught with challenges, and the tragic loss of Challenger in 1986 reminded the world of the risks involved. But space exploration continued, driven by a shared desire to learn, to grow, and to push the boundaries of what was possible. The era of government space agencies, defined by the space race and Cold War competition, began to give way to a new age, one that increasingly saw the involvement of private companies and international collaboration. The end of the Cold War had shifted the focus away from rivalry, but space exploration remained as captivating as ever. In the 1990s, the International Space Station ISS began to take shape in low Earth orbit. Launched in 1998, the ISS represented a groundbreaking collaboration between the United States, Russia, Canada, Japan, and Europe. The station became a symbol of what the world could achieve together. Transcending the nationalistic ambitions of the past and placing scientific research above competition, it became humanity's largest and most complex space laboratory, orbiting Earth at a speed of over 17,000 miles per hour, with astronauts from different nations living and working in space for extended periods. While the ISS continues to serve as a hub for international cooperation, scientific research, and technological innovation, it also laid the groundwork for a new direction in space exploration: the privatization of space. Enter SpaceX, founded by entrepreneur Elon Musk in 2002. Musk's vision was clear: to reduce the cost of space travel and make it possible for humans to live on other planets, particularly Mars. SpaceX's success in developing reusable rockets revolutionized space travel. In 2012, SpaceX's Dragon capsule became the first privately built spacecraft to deliver cargo to the ISS. In 2020, SpaceX achieved another milestone when its Crew Dragon spacecraft carried astronauts to the ISS, marking the first time since the Space Shuttle's retirement that American astronauts were launched into space from US soil. SpaceX wasn't the only private player. Companies like Blue Origin, founded by Amazon's Jeff Bezos, and Virgin Galactic, founded by Sir Richard Branson, have also made significant strides in commercial space travel, focusing on suborbital flights for tourists and research. These companies are not just changing the business of space, they're redefining what's possible for private citizens to experience in space. The future of space exploration now includes plans for lunar colonies, Mars missions, and commercial space stations, with companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin developing the necessary infrastructure to make interplanetary travel a reality. In 2021, SpaceX's Starship completed successful test flights designed for deep space missions. NASA, too, has partnered with private firms to build the Artemis lunar program, which aims to land humans on the Moon once again, with plans for a sustainable presence by the 2020s. Space, once the domain of only the world's greatest superpowers, is now an accessible frontier for many nations and private companies. The dream of exploring Mars, of establishing a human presence on other planets, is no longer just the stuff of science fiction. It is the next great leap in human ambition. And just like during the space race, the stars are calling once again. In the vast sun-baked expanse of Egypt, where the golden sands stretch endlessly beneath a blazing sky, there lies a mystery, a lost wonder of the ancient world. A place so incredible that, according to the great historian Herodotus, it was more magnificent than even the great pyramids of Giza. It was called the Labyrinth, an enormous underground complex unlike anything ever seen before, stretching far beneath the earth and the monuments of Egypt. The Egyptians themselves described it as a marvel of both architecture and ingenuity, a labyrinthine structure so intricate it defied the imagination. Herodotus, the Greek historian who travelled extensively in the 5th century BC, was one of the first to write about this astonishing sight. In his travels, he was brought to Egypt, where he had the opportunity to see the labyrinth firsthand. What he witnessed left him in awe. According to his writings, the structure was composed of vast chambers, intricately designed corridors, and towering walls, far surpassing the grandeur of any known structure at the time. It wasn't just a building, it was a labyrinth of monumental proportions filled with secrets and hidden spaces. The labyrinth, Herodotus described, consisted of 12 immense courtyards surrounded by high stone walls. Inside, the chambers were filled with carvings, statues, and inscriptions depicting the gods and the kings who had ruled Egypt throughout the ages. And perhaps most intriguing of all, Herodotus wrote of the structure's sheer size, not just a few rooms or passageways, but a sprawling complex stretching over vast areas. Herodotus claimed the labyrinth was so large and complex that it was impossible to explore it fully. He even compared it to the pyramids themselves, noting that it was more wondrous and impressive. But like so many ancient marvels, the labyrinth soon faded from view, hidden beneath the sands of Egypt. Over time, the labyrinth became a legend. Despite its immense significance, it disappeared from history, buried beneath the shifting desert sands, as though the land itself had swallowed it whole. Today, scholars and archaeologists continue to search for the lost labyrinth, hoping to uncover its secrets and unlock the mysteries that have remained hidden for centuries. The labyrinth that Herodotus described was not just a building, it was a masterpiece of design, one so intricate that it seemed to stretch the very limits of human ingenuity. According to his account, the structure was more than just a collection of rooms or passageways. It was a vast, sprawling complex, its scale and complexity a testament to the ancient Egyptians' mastery of architecture and engineering. Herodotus famously noted that the labyrinth consisted of 12 courtyards, each one separated by towering stone walls that encased the labyrinth like a series of fortress-like enclosures. These walls were adorned with intricate carvings and scenes depicting the gods, the kings, and the mythological creatures that populated Egyptian beliefs. Some of these depictions were said to be so detailed they appeared almost lifelike, a breathtaking blend of art and architecture. What made the labyrinth so unique was its sheer scale. Herodotus described the labyrinth as having a vast network of interconnected chambers, some so large they could house entire villages within their walls. He went on to compare it to the pyramids in terms of magnificence, though unlike the pyramids, which had a singular focus, the labyrinth seemed to hold endless secrets, each turn, each passageway, leading to another mystery. Herodotus also noted the astonishing number of statues within the labyrinth. These statues were not just simple representations, they were said to be works of immense artistic skill. Some of these statues were crafted to resemble the gods of Egypt, while others were of the pharaohs themselves, immortalized in stone. One particularly striking description involved a colossal statue of the god Osiris, which towered over the labyrinth's central chamber, serving as a constant reminder of the divine presence that pervaded the entire complex. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Herodotus's account was his description of the labyrinth's layout. The rooms and passageways were not just haphazardly arranged. They were designed to confuse, to create a sense of mystery, a true labyrinth in every sense of the word. Herodotus said it was impossible to explore the entire structure in a single visit. It was too vast, too intricate. He ended his description with an air of awe, noting that the labyrinth was a permanent wonder, one that would stand for millennia, or so it seemed at the time. But despite the grandeur of Herodotus's account, the labyrinth was lost to history, hidden beneath the sands of Egypt, a mystery waiting to be rediscovered. The legend of the lost labyrinth has haunted historians, archaeologists, and treasure hunters for centuries. Despite Herodotus's vivid description of the magnificent underground complex, the labyrinth's exact location remains a mystery. Scholars have long debated where it might be hidden beneath the Egyptian sands, and whether it still lies intact beneath the layers of time and shifting dunes. Most agree that the labyrinth was most likely situated near Lake Moris, an ancient artificial lake in the Egyptian desert near the Fume Oasis, about 60 miles south of Cairo. Herodotus himself had mentioned this location as the site of the labyrinth, linking it to the impressive structure built by the pharaoh Amenhotep II during the 12th dynasty around 1800 BCE. The Fume Oasis, with its fertile lands and proximity to the Nile, had long been a thriving area of Egypt, and many believed that the labyrinth was part of a larger temple complex. This complex might have been dedicated to the god crocodile Sobek, whose ancient cult was centered around the area. Some theories even suggest that the labyrinth was built as a temple to Sobek, perhaps to honor his association with the Nile and its cycles. Over the years, various attempts to locate the labyrinth have been made, but the shifting desert sands have provided little in the way of concrete evidence. In the 19th century, British archaeologists and explorers led expeditions into the Fiume region, but they came back with only fragmented remnants and unclear artifacts. They found some curious ruins, large rectangular stone structures which some believed might have been part of the labyrinth's walls. But these findings were inconclusive, and no one has yet identified a definitive structure connected to the labyrinth itself. In modern times, technologies such as satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and drones have provided new hope for discovering the labyrinth. The desert is still vast, and the sand continues to shift and bury anything that might lie beneath. In recent years, some researchers believe they may be closing in on the labyrinth's location, suggesting that the complex could be buried beneath what appears to be a series of vast, unexplored ruins near the Fiume. Still, the labyrinth's exact location remains elusive, and the possibility of it still being hidden beneath the sand is both tantalizing and frustrating. As with many great mysteries of the ancient world, the lost labyrinth calls out to those who dare to uncover its secrets. The question is not only where it lies, but what treasures or even secrets it might still hold within its walls. The lost labyrinth of Egypt was not just a monumental structure, it was part of a much larger symbolic and spiritual landscape. To understand the significance of the labyrinth, one must consider its relationship to Egypt's other great wonders, particularly the pyramids, which have long been considered the pinnacle of ancient Egyptian architectural achievement. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built for the pharaoh Khufu, stands as a testament to Egypt's power and the complexity of their religious and architectural systems. It is no surprise that Herodotus, when describing the labyrinth, would compare it to the pyramids, considering them both products of the same cultural and spiritual world. While the pyramids are often associated with the burial of kings and the afterlife, the labyrinth may have had a different function, yet equally steeped in symbolism. Some theories suggest that the labyrinth was built as a temple complex dedicated not to one specific god, but to the broader cosmic forces of Egypt, incorporating the various gods and mythologies that governed the cycles of life, death, and rebirth. Like the pyramids, the labyrinth's design could have been tied to Egyptian cosmology. Ancient Egyptians believed in a complex layered universe, one that blended the material and spiritual realms. The labyrinth, with its vast corridors and hidden chambers, could have symbolized the journey of the soul through the afterlife. Much like the pyramids, which were designed as tombs to facilitate the pharaoh's passage into the next life, the comparison between the pyramids and the labyrinth suggests that both were not simply monumental feats of engineering, but symbolic representations of life's great mysteries. Some scholars even propose that the labyrinth might have served a ritualistic function where initiates would go through a series of trials and spiritual experiences within its corridors, reflecting the journey of the soul through the underworld, a passageway to divine enlightenment, much like the spiritual journey that was symbolized by the pyramids. Moreover, Herodotus himself believed that the labyrinth had an intricate network of passages and chambers similar in their complexity to the passages inside the pyramids. This idea suggests a deep architectural connection, a shared symbolic purpose to guide both the living and the dead through spaces that blurred the boundaries between the material world and the afterlife. Though the exact connection between the labyrinth and the pyramids remains unclear, one thing is certain. Both structures embodied the grand vision of ancient Egypt, a civilization that looked beyond the physical world toward the mysteries of the cosmos and the eternal. The lost labyrinth of Egypt was not simply a structure built for practical purposes like a palace or a marketplace. Its existence was shrouded in mystery, and the very design of the labyrinth suggests it was a place of profound spiritual and symbolic significance. The complex network of corridors and chambers, its intricate layout, and its scale all point to a deeper purpose, one that goes beyond mere architecture. Many theories suggest that the labyrinth was a sacred site, a place where ancient rituals and religious ceremonies were held. The labyrinth may have served as a temple complex dedicated to the worship of multiple gods, with the Egyptian pantheon of deities playing central roles in its design. The Egyptians were a deeply religious people, and their monuments often carried spiritual meaning with each structure, symbolizing different aspects of the afterlife, cosmic order, and the journey of the soul. One compelling theory is that the labyrinth was a representation of the afterlife itself. In ancient Egyptian belief, the journey to the afterlife was complex and treacherous. The soul of the deceased had to navigate the many challenges and obstacles that stood between it and the divine realm. The labyrinth, with its maze-like structure and hidden chambers, may have symbolized the trials and tribulations the soul had to endure in the afterlife. Just as the deceased had to find their way through the winding passages of the labyrinth, they also had to navigate the journey through the underworld, guided by the gods and their faith. The labyrinth could also have been a ritualistic space where priests and initiates underwent spiritual tests and trials. Some speculate that it was the site of ancient Egyptian mystery schools, where sacred knowledge was imparted to chosen individuals. The initiates might have been led through the labyrinth in a carefully constructed ritual meant to mirror their journey of spiritual enlightenment. The idea of a physical labyrinth representing the journey of the soul is a powerful one, as it would provide a direct connection between the physical world and the spiritual one, linking the ancient Egyptians' understanding of life, death, and rebirth. Another theory holds that the labyrinth was connected to astronomical alignments. The ancient Egyptians were keenly aware of the stars and celestial movements which guided their agricultural calendar and religious practices. The labyrinth could have been built in alignment with the stars, with its passages and chambers, reflecting the patterns of the night sky, perhaps mirroring the path of the sun or the journey of the soul through the stars. Whatever its true purpose, the lost labyrinth remains an enigma. Its symbolism, its mysteries, and its profound connection to the ancient Egyptian worldview continue to captivate those who seek to uncover the secrets buried beneath the sands. For centuries, the lost labyrinth of Egypt has remained a mystery, buried beneath the shifting sands of time. But the fascination with this incredible structure has not waned. Archaeologists, historians, and explorers continue to search for the labyrinth, hoping that modern technology and renewed curiosity might finally reveal the secrets hidden beneath Egypt's vast desert. The search for the labyrinth has been a long and difficult one. Early explorers and archaeologists, using the limited tools of their time, sought in vain for the legendary site. In the 19th century, European expeditions ventured into the desert, particularly around the Fume Oasis and Lake Morris, which Herodotus had indicated as the labyrinth's possible location. However, these early searches turned up little beyond scattered ruins and unclear remnants, enough to spark interest, but not enough to make any definitive discoveries. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the search for the labyrinth has gained new momentum thanks to advancements in technology. Satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and modern excavation methods have provided fresh tools in the search for the lost wonder. With the help of aerial surveys and satellite imaging, researchers have been able to scan vast stretches of the desert where the labyrinth is thought to lie. Some scholars believe that beneath the sands there may still be hidden remains of massive stone structures, echoes of the great labyrinth Herodotus described. One of the key locations consistently linked to the labyrinth is the area around Lake Morris and the Fume Oasis near the ancient city of Crocodilopolis. It was here, according to Herodotus and other ancient sources, that the labyrinth was constructed. The Fam region was a fertile oasis, and the area's importance in Egyptian civilization makes it a promising candidate for housing the labyrinth. Over the years, archaeologists have uncovered traces of ancient stone foundations and architectural remnants in this area, though they have yet to find definitive evidence of the labyrinth itself. In recent decades, there have been occasional reports of underwater ruins discovered in the area around Lake Muris, sparking renewed interest in the site. Some experts believe that parts of the labyrinth may lie submerged beneath the lake, hidden by thousands of years of sediment and water. Others speculate that the labyrinth could be buried under a sand dune near the remnants of ancient Egyptian cities or temples. Despite these advancements, the labyrinth's discovery remains elusive, but the search is far from over. Each new excavation, every new scan of the desert brings with it a glimmer of hope that one day the lost labyrinth may emerge once again, offering up its secrets to the modern world. The sands of Egypt may hold more than just a forgotten building. They may hold the keys to understanding the deep, spiritual and architectural ingenuity of one of history's most remarkable civilizations. The search for the lost labyrinth is not just an archaeological quest, it's an attempt to uncover a hidden chapter of Egypt's history, a chapter that could dramatically alter our understanding of the ancient world. If the labyrinth is ever found, it would provide unprecedented insights into the architecture, religion, and daily life of one of the most advanced civilizations in history. One of the most tantalizing aspects of the labyrinth is the possibility that it holds ancient Egyptian knowledge that has been lost for millennia. The labyrinth, with its intricate corridors, chambers, and symbolic carvings, could be a repository of sacred texts or ritualistic knowledge. Some scholars speculate that it could contain documents that explain the deeper spiritual beliefs of the Egyptians, possibly shedding light on the mysteries of the afterlife, the gods they worshipped, and the rituals they performed to ensure the passage of the soul to the next world. If these texts or symbols were preserved within the labyrinth, they could offer a glimpse into Egypt's religious practices and rituals, revealing aspects of their civilization that have been obscured by time. The labyrinth might also offer new clues about how the ancient Egyptians viewed the cosmos and their understanding of the heavens, which played such a central role in their culture. Many believe that the labyrinth's design was not just an architectural wonder, but also a reflection of astronomical alignments or cosmological concepts, tying the physical space to the divine. Moreover, the labyrinth's discovery could also revolutionize our understanding of ancient Egyptian architecture. The sheer size and complexity of the structure, as described by Herodotus, suggests that it was built with advanced engineering techniques that might have influenced later architectural marvels. Archaeologists are particularly interested in how the labyrinth may have influenced the design of other monumental structures like the pyramids and the temples that dotted Egypt's landscape. But the implications go beyond just religious or architectural history. The labyrinth could also tell us more about the social and political structure of Egypt. Was it built by the will of a single pharaoh? Or was it a collaborative effort that involved many different workers and craftsmen? What does its construction say about the organization of ancient Egyptian society? The discovery of the labyrinth would not just add a chapter to Egyptology. It would rewrite parts of it, bringing new revelations about the ancient Egyptian civilization and its place in the history of the world. For now, the labyrinth remains hidden, a shadow beneath the sands. But with every new piece of evidence uncovered, the possibility of finding it grows closer. The mysteries of the ancient world are still waiting to be unlocked, and the lost labyrinth may one day emerge from the shadows to reveal its secrets. The lost labyrinth of Egypt has long been seen as more than just a physical structure. Its symbolic significance, woven into the fabric of Egyptian culture, has echoed through history, influencing not only the myths of ancient Egypt, but also the narratives of later civilizations. Even in its absence, the idea of the labyrinth has continued to captivate the human imagination. In ancient Egypt, labyrinths were not just architectural marvels, they were symbolic representations of the journey of the soul. The maze-like structure of the labyrinth may have been designed to mirror the difficult path the deceased had to navigate to reach the afterlife. In Egyptian cosmology, the afterlife was a realm full of challenges, trials, and mysteries, where only the worthy would pass through the gates to eternal life. The labyrinth, with its many twists and turns, might have served as a metaphor for the soul's journey through these trials. The labyrinth's role in Egyptian culture was perhaps linked to the worship of Sobek, the crocodile god, whose temples were often placed in the Fume region. Sobek was believed to be both a creator and a destroyer, a duality reflected in the labyrinth's ability to both guide and confound. The symbolism of a hidden, mysterious maze with its guarded secrets might have represented the dual nature of the divine, both nurturing and terrifying, but the influence of the labyrinth did not end with Egypt. As the centuries passed, the idea of the labyrinth spread across cultures and myths. The most famous of these myths is the story of the labyrinth of Cree, designed by the legendary craftsman Daedalus. In Greek mythology, the labyrinth was built to house the Minotaur, a half-man, half-bull creature. This labyrinth, unlike the Egyptian version, was associated with confusion and entrapment, a place where only those lost within its walls could face destruction. Over time, the concept of the labyrinth evolved, taking on different meanings across cultures. In medieval Europe, the labyrinth became a symbol of the spiritual journey, often depicted in the floors of cathedrals as a path of prayer and meditation. Pilgrims would walk the labyrinth's intricate paths as a symbol of their own journey towards salvation. The idea of the labyrinth as a sacred space, a space that requires both wisdom and courage to navigate, transcended borders and cultures, connecting it to the broader human experience of seeking answers, truth, and enlightenment. The labyrinth's connection to both life and death, as well as its association with spiritual trials, ensures its place as a symbol that transcends time. Whether it was in Egypt, Greece, or later religious traditions, the labyrinth has remained a powerful metaphor for the complexities of the human soul and its struggle to find meaning and purpose. Though the lost labyrinth of Egypt remains hidden beneath the sands, its symbolic legacy continues to inspire and provoke thought. It reminds us that some mysteries, though buried, are timeless, waiting to be uncovered when the world is ready to understand their deeper meanings. The search for the lost labyrinth of Egypt is far from over, and with each passing year, new technologies and methods bring us closer to uncovering its hidden secrets. Though it has remained elusive for centuries, the labyrinth continues to captivate the imaginations of archaeologists and explorers alike, drawing attention to the mystery of this ancient wonder and the possibility of unlocking one of the greatest lost sites of Egypt. The region surrounding Lake Morris and the Fiume Oasis continues to be the primary focus of excavations. Many believe that the labyrinth lies buried somewhere near the ancient city of Crocodilopolis, a once thriving hub that was home to a temple dedicated to Sobek, the crocodile god. This location is central to the theories that place the labyrinth in the Fiume, as Herodotus himself made connections between the two in his writings. In recent decades, advanced technology has breathed new life into the search. Satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar (GPR) have allowed researchers to explore areas previously inaccessible or unknown, providing new clues about what might lie beneath the surface. These technologies have enabled archaeologists to detect signs of hidden structures, even those that might be buried beneath thick layers of sand. In 2017, an aerial survey conducted over the Fiume Oasis revealed anomalies in the terrain, large rectangular formations that could suggest the presence of ruins or ancient walls, potentially marking the labyrinth's location. Despite these promising discoveries, much of the labyrinth remains hidden, and the desert's shifting sands continue to obscure the full extent of what might be buried beneath them. Some believe that part of the labyrinth could be submerged beneath Lake Morris, which has changed shape over the millennia. The idea that parts of the labyrinth could lie beneath the water's surface offers new hope for those who believe it is still out there, waiting to be rediscovered.